Welcome to the Community Based Adaptation Conference in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I've got with me now Ian Burton, Professor Emeritus, University of Toronto, but to many people sort of Mr. Adaptation, really. You've been involved with adaptation for a long time. In fact, maybe you could just give us a little bit of background on how you got involved with it or why you think it's such a big issue.
Well, I really actually came to climate change and adaptation from the natural hazards and disasters and risk community, which is where I'd spent most of my academic and also time that I spent with the government of Canada and some international work on natural hazards, floods and droughts and issues like that from a perspective of adaptation. So when the climate issue came along, it was just a natural area for me to move into and to move into the adaptation side of climate change rather than the mitigation side, because that's what I knew all about.
Well, it does sort of beg the question. People have always adapted to natural disasters and changes. Do we need a special discipline and a special interest because of climate change?
Yes, we do, because adaptation to the hazards and risks that are associated with climate change are different and additional. So if you think of droughts, for example, there are lots of places in the world that suffer from drought. And what they do is they say they have a drought and then the drought ends and then they get on with their lives and they have a more humid rainfall period and they recover from the drought and they get ready for the next one. And then there's the next drought and they deal with that. So it's on and off again. But what we're going to have in some parts of the world with climate change is that those droughts are going to get more intense and they're going to get longer and longer and longer. And eventually in some places the end of one drought is going to coincide with the beginning of the next one. So what you have there is not just an intermittent drought, but you have progressive drying out or progressive desiccation, and that really is a very different kind of problem. And you have the same with lots of other climate hazards. As well as the sort of extreme events, there's also this incremental linking them together. So adaptation to climate change still means adaptation to climate extremes that we've been used to in the past, but it does enter a new realm in that way.
It sounds like trying to adapt to permanent crisis.
Well, well, let's hope it's not permanent, but it's certainly likely to go on for a long, long time, partly because reducing greenhouse gas emissions is proving to be so difficult to achieve. I'm not entirely pessimistic about that, but I think it will take a long time. So we are going to have to deal with a lot of impacts of climate change for decades to come, everywhere in the world. And one talks a lot about vulnerable and poor people and least developed countries, and that's true. But also the developed countries are not going to be immune from this, and they are also going to be severely impacted, yes.
You may not be too pessimistic about mitigation and slowing or stopping climate change, but presumably the doubts about tackling it are now so grave and widespread. That is one of the reasons that there's so much more emphasis on adaptation.
Yes, I think that's right. I think when in the early days of the Climate Convention, when we started to talk about this seriously in the early 1990s, there was a sort of optimism on two grounds. People thought that reducing greenhouse gas emissions would not be so difficult, but they also thought that climate change would evolve somewhat more slowly, and so there would be a longer period of time available to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And what we found out is that reducing them is very, very difficult to get off the fossil fuel reliance on fossil fuels, but also climate change is now happening faster than we thought way back in the 1990s that it was going to. So that means that people realize much more that we are willy-nilly going to have to adapt simply because it's taking much longer to mitigate.
Well, this conference is part of that process of presumably sharing and learning to adapt, but do you think there's enough going on in terms of adaptation and studying it and learning what to do?
Well, I've described this meeting as a sort of the beginning of a movement, of a wave of interest and funding and practice for adaptation. And is there enough? No, certainly not. but are there good signs that it's happening and it's spreading and people are becoming more aware and people are recognizing the need for funds to support this, and people are perceiving this problem much more clearly than they have in the past? So is there enough? No. But is it happening? Yes.
What's your wish list? You've mentioned funds. Is it money or is it something else? If you could just name one or two issues that you think, or solutions, if there were such a thing, in the world to deal with adaptation, what would you hope would happen, or what do you think are the priorities?
Well, a number of things. I think one is that the talk of a large amount of money being made at available at the international level. So, for example, people are talking in the climate negotiations in Cancun last December about a fund of $100 billion on an annual basis by 2020, most of which might go into adaptation. That's very good news on the one hand, but on the other hand, when large institutions like governments and the World Bank and others have large amounts of money to spend, it tends to distort the way in which the money gets spent and the priorities get selected. And because there are high transaction costs in doing this kind of work, there tends to be a preference for large projects, for sort of concrete adaptation where you can actually pour the concrete and cut the ribbon and see all that kind of thing. And what this conference is about is really something quite different. It's how do you adapt on a small scale, community way, dealing with problems locally with the technology and the community organization that you have. And it's a huge problem of getting large sums of money at the international level down to the place where it's most needed. And there are lots of obstacles to that, and this conference about community-based adaptation is partly about addressing that problem and getting attention and trying to break the disconnect that there is between international and local. You know, we used to talk in development in the old days about trickle down. You know, you would get development at the high end of the scale and the benefits would eventually trickle down to the... I think what we're looking at here, I hope is what we're looking at here, is what I'd like to call a flood up. And we're really trying to say, look, you guys, get real and get with where it's at.
But you must go to a lot of these meetings and read the literature and so on. Is there sort of new thinking in this area, or is everyone still at that stage where they're suddenly thinking, wow, this is going to be a big problem, we'd better talk about it?
Well, there is new thinking, and I think there needs to be new thinking. And I mean, one characteristic of adaptation and certainly of this meeting, but I think more generally, is adaptation has been thought of very much at a local level, a community level, and a project level. It's something that you fund a project here and a project there, and so on. And that's good, and we certainly should do that. I'm not discouraging that at all. But I would say that we also now have to think about adaptation in a more strategic, in a strategic way. Adaptation is not only a local problem; it is also a regional, a transboundary, and an international, and if you like, a global problem. Because the way we're going to have to adapt our societies, our governance and decision-making structures, our economy, indeed. Is going to require quite a fundamental change and transformation. So I think there is beginning to be thinking about that. It's come somewhat more slowly to the adaptation side than to the mitigation side. But I think it's beginning. I can see signs of it. And what's very interesting about this meeting is the mix of people you have. You have very sort of NGO frontline people who've been working in villages and talking on the front line. And then you have a lot of academics and university and research institute people mixing in with that. And I think it's extremely rich to put those two communities together because they have a lot to learn from each other.
Okay, I think we should leave it with this lovely idea of flooding up information and experience. My mind can't quite... Well, it's a lovely idea. So thank you very much, Ian Burton from University of Toronto. Or as I understand, you don't use the T's, it's Toronto, isn't it?
Oh, well, that's right.
Anyway, thank you very much for coming in.
Welcome.
Is that okay? It's all right.